Welcome to the communication lecture. This lecture is going to focus on communication at work and how to have effective communication. The first thing to look at is the communication cycle, and there's 4 pieces to that cycle. We're going to assume in this lecture that you are always the person who is the sender. So you're sending or expressing some type of message to someone else. When you're in class in small groups, I'd like you to talk about some personal examples of when knowing your audience actually helped you form the way you said what you said. The one example I will use in this lecture is that if you're going to ask your parents to let you quit your job so they give you more money, and that way by quitting your job you can get better grades in your classes, that presentation to your parents is going to sound very different than it would be if you were talking to friends. So you need to keep in mind that whoever your audience is should really dictate what you say and how you say it. You also need to identify the goal. At the end, what is the goal of your presentation? What do you want to have happen after you're finished? And the last question I hope you remember forever is, if you go fishing, what goes on the hook? If you're going fishing and steak and lobster is your favorite meal, would you put steak and lobster on the hook because it's your favorite meal? How about cheesecake? Let's say cheesecake is your favorite dessert, and you go fishing. Would you take some cheesecake to put on the hook for the fish? Most of you probably think that's absurd to even ask. However, in communication, it's critical that you remember that. Whatever your audience likes, whatever your audience needs to hear, that's what goes on the hook. If you want to hook in your audience, you need to be sure that what you put on that hook is what they like. Your message needs to be formatted or framed in a way that they will hear it because it's focusing on their needs. The next part of the communication cycle is the medium in which you transmit messages. Sometimes messages are transmitted verbally, sometimes they're transmitted in writing. Next, the recipient interprets what you send. So you may send a message to 5 people, and in reality, all 5 people may interpret that message differently. And that's why the next part of the cycle is so important, and that is feedback. Your recipients are going to provide you feedback. So if you do a 5-minute presentation and pause to see how they're doing, and you find out they do not understand what you're saying, you need to go back and reestablish your message and the medium you're sending it because you want them to understand. So one last comment about the communication cycle. I want to share with you something a dean shared with me at my last job. He told me that I have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And he then said to me, that means you should listen twice as much as you speak. And I tell you that, I want to remind you that listening is part of the communication cycle. And I encourage all of you to listen twice as much as you speak. So effective communication is sent through a medium, it's received by recipients, and they give you feedback. When you know what someone's goals are, it helps you frame messages so that they're heard and understood. So what types of communication do you think might happen while you're at your internship? I'll give you about 6 seconds to think about that. The first type of communication we're going to look at is oral communication. And oral communication could be informal or formal. However, informal communication at work does not sound like informal communication with your friends. Because you're in a work setting, even informal communication has to have a sound of formality because you're at work. Formal oral communication typically asks you to present who, what, when, where, and how. Again, you need to know your audience. It's okay to use note cards for presentations, but your note cards should not have sentences on them. The worst thing that can happen in a presentation is if you read from your note cards or you read from the slides. So what's on the note cards and slides should be enough to remind you what you want to say. And it's always important to have visuals with any presentation you do. This way people not only hear you, but they get to see what you're trying to present to them. So effective verbal communication, you need to ask yourself who's the audience and what's the purpose. If you were doing a business presentation or trying to persuade a group to do something or talking to someone about a financial report, each of those verbal communications would sound different than each of the others. You need to be thorough and succinct. You need to dress appropriately. You should not have on a lot of jewelry or a lot of makeup, and no cracks, creases, or crevices should be showing. Nobody wants to see those parts of your body. And if you like wearing baggy pants, nobody wants to see your underwear either. None of those are appropriate at work. You need to respect the space of other people. And so that often requires you to understand cultural aspects, as different cultures have different expectations. An example that I'm going to give you is I worked with someone who was from the Philippine Islands, and when he would come to see me, he would stand in the doorway. And I finally realized in his culture it was not appropriate to walk into my office as his boss unless I invited him. So when he would come to see me, I would actually have to say, "Would you like to come in and have a seat?" And then he would come in. Unlike other people in my department, they would just come in and sit down and talk to me. So knowing culture and different aspects of culture sometimes helps you understand space issues. And then anytime you have verbal communication with someone, you really should summarize it in an email thoroughly and succinctly. The next type of communication we're going to discuss is written communication, and it also can be informal or formal. Again, informal communication at work does not sound like informal communication with your friends. An informal message you send to someone in writing at work does not look like an informal message you would send to your friends. And there's also formal communication at work that's written. So effective written communication follows the same guidelines as the verbal. Who's the audience? What's the purpose? And you need to be thorough and succinct. So an example I will give you is in my last job, my deans never wanted written reports from me. If they called and said, "Mickey, we want you to give us a list of your top 5 programs, what they cost, how long they take, and any other important information," I would then list in bulleted format, program 1, and all the details they asked me for bulleted. I might add a sheet of paper or 2 with details, but I knew my audience. My deans did not want a written report. So that's very important, because if you give your supervisor a written report and all they want is bullets, it's very annoying. And the reverse is true. If they want a report and you give them bullets, that's not going to go well either. So all of these items are important in effective communication that's written. So let's look at email. Email is always supposed to have a salutation, and that salutation is hello, dear John, dear Mickey, something. You're not supposed to just start talking in an email. You're supposed to have a salutation, which is an opening to your email. Every now and then you will come across people who do not like that. Personally, I don't see a need for it, but professionally it's required. So when I would start communicating with someone who didn't like all that stuff, our emails to each other would be very different. Like in the subject line, it would have the sentence, a question, and then, "What do you think?" And then they would email me back an answer. But in reality, professionally, you are supposed to have emails that have a salutation. There's no informal slang in a work setting. You shouldn't be doing LOL or OMG or LMAO, which would be a definite no. Those kind of slangs in a typical work setting are not appropriate. However, once you make relationships with certain people at work, your emails might change a little bit. Always put what the subject is in the subject line. This is really important. So when I was a director of Health and Human Services at my last job, it was normal that I got over 100 emails a day. So if I had 10 minutes to look at emails, I would scan through first to see who sent the email. If the vice president of instruction sent me an email, it got opened. If my dean sent me an email, it got opened. I only have 10 minutes. I'm going for the most important ones. The next item I would look at is the subject line. If the subject line said urgent, I was going to open and read that email. However, if it said urgent, I wanted it to be an urgent message that I had to see right away. It didn't have to be something I could look at 2 hours later. Your subject line needs to indicate what you're doing. An example of a subject line could be health fair update FYI. If you're sending that message to members of your group, they know it's an update, it's an FYI on what you're doing. That should get a really different response than if it says health fair, urgent, no vendors. Okay, I would think that would get their attention more. So make sure your subject line is important and make sure that there's only one subject per email. The reason that is, and if you just stop and think, why would you only have one subject per email? The main reason is if you're trying to track a subject line throughout a series of emails, it is much better to have one subject per email because I can type health fair and all the emails for health fair come up. But if there's an email that says health fair, food, Health 315, and Health 432, that's going to be much harder to track in my email system. The other reason is if you have 5 subjects in one email, it's very hard for the person to keep track if they've done everything. So typically, emails on which you're working stay in one location in your email, and when they're completed, they move someplace else. But if there's 5 subjects in one email, it's really difficult to keep track of what you've successfully completed. When I would send my employees emails, it would drive them crazy because they might get 3 or 4 emails in a row from me. But each email had a different topic, and I was going through my staff to see one person at a time what I needed to send. The length of the emails are not supposed to be dissertations or essays. They're supposed to be brief. I had an employee who would spend 3 or 4 hours writing an email that was very eloquent, but it was not appropriate. It's okay to bullet items in an email. You need to know when to copy other people and who to copy. And if you're sending it to more than one person, you need to make sure that they are listed in order from highest level to lowest level. So if I were sending an email in my prior job to 4 people, the order in which it would go would be president, vice president, dean, and a colleague. That lets them, it's a clear delineation of highest level to lowest level. Also realize when you send something or you copy it to someone, they can forward on what you say. So the next question, are you proud of what you've written? You need to understand that what you put in writing is there forever. Everyone usually does this once in their career, but only once. And I've done it once. I have not done it twice. A couple jobs ago, someone was going to file a harassment claim against their supervisor, and he emailed me and asked me for some information, and I accidentally copied our supervisor. I'm not even sure how I did that, but I did. You don't want to do that. Another time I was responding to an email and I was a little too curt in my response, and that person forwarded it to my supervisor. So you need to be really careful of what you write. Not only do you need to be proud of what you've written, you need to understand that everything in writing becomes a legal document. So there are times at this position I'm in now where I will email something to Dr. Hutton Rogers that says, here's how I feel about that, and next time I see you, I'll elaborate. And that means there's things I need to tell you that I'm not willing to put in writing. Reply all. In most cases, it's wrong to reply all. You should only reply to the person who sent it in most cases. And the last item is, before you hit that send button, make sure what you've written is okay. Every now and then at work, someone will say, can you read this email and see if you think it's too mean or whatever? If you have to ask that question, you shouldn't send it. So the last thing I typically tell you to do if you're starting a new email chain, it's not a response to someone, it's best to put to whom last. Because that way if you change your mind and you accidentally hit the send button, it doesn't go anywhere. Texting is informal. It doesn't have the same standards, but it's still, you need to be careful what you text. Again, it's there. It's in writing, and it can be forwarded to other people. You need to read before you send, especially autocorrect. When your phones or your tablets autocorrect what you write, sometimes what you write is not really what you meant. Every now and then my autocorrect will change my words to curse words, and that's not a good thing at work. You need to make sure your text message is brief but still grammatically correct as possible. However, people know that when you're texting, it's not the same. And so, for example, a lot of phones now allow you to speak your message into the phone. But when you do that, there's no periods or commas or question marks. It's just like one long rambling paragraph. But people do understand that when you're texting, that does happen. So it's a little more relaxed, but still you need to remember you're at work. Remember, everything you put in writing stays forever. It represents who you are. You could be a genius, but if what you put in writing looks like you're illiterate, people assume you're not smart. So stop and think before you write, and definitely stop and think before you hit the send button. So that's the end of this lecture on the type of communication that's likely to occur in your work site. I hope you find it helpful, and I'll see you in class next week.